Hello and welcome to Developmental Psychology. We're going to start right away with Chapter 1 and work our way through. Now, Chapter 1 is going to be a little different than the rest of the chapters. Where we're going to be looking at in this chapter is sort of an overview of human development and the study of human development. When we get into the later chapters, starting with sort of Chapter 3, we're really going to start hitting different ages. So we want to start with a basic definition of human development. And what we're talking about here in this class is we're going to be looking at how people change over a period of time as we think about it, who we were when we were 5 versus who we were when we were 10, 15, 20, 25, and multiple ages after that really changes. And so this looks at those changes. We're going to look at some physiological changes, some psychological changes, but basically it's going to be looking at the change. Now, this is not based on just one particular area of science, human development. This is going to be looking at multiple areas. So it's not just psychology, but it'll be physiology and social concepts. So there's going to be a lot to do within this class. Now, there are going to be 3 themes that we keep talking about, and the first one is going to be nature versus nurture. So the question is how much who am I based on my genes that I got from my parents, and who am I based on the environment? And this is something that's always a controversy between the two. How much does each one give? So, is your IQ because of your parents, or is your IQ because you were able to go to special schools and got all kinds of special treatment and you got high IQ things? Which one really influenced your IQ the most? And we know that there's going to be some that's based on your environment, and there's going to be some that's going to be based on your genetics. And we'll be looking at that. Now, continuity versus discontinuity. Basically, is this a smooth pass or do we have stages? Now, this one's pretty easy to spot when you talk about things because if we talk about stages, so we'll talk about a gentleman named Erikson later on, and we talk about his stages of development, which means he sees this as discontinuity, which means it's not smooth and keep going. Whereas our physical development, we can think of that as sort of continuality, that there's not really a stop and start sort of to that process when we're talking about babies growing. Now, universal versus context specific development. The question is there only one way to develop, or does our society and our environments and where we grow, does that affect the way that we develop? And so your book gives a really good example about how the children in the United States don't learn to count money until they're, somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd grade is when we really begin to work on money. And yet there are kids in other parts of the world which are counting money very early in life. Many of them are doing money and stuff like this by the time they're 5 or 6. They're down in the marketplaces selling basic things. So that kind of shows us that learning to count money is not a universal thing. It doesn't happen all the same time around the world. It's rather a context specific thing. The forces that we'll be talking about that tends to make up this subject is first our biological forces, so that's our genetics and health related things. We'll talk about the psychological forces within development, and cognitive is one of the things we talk about the most. Now, cognitive is a word that sometimes people hear, sometimes don't hear, but let's make sure we're all on the same page for this definition. Cognitive is thinking. Some of you might think of it as the mind. When we say what's the study of psychology and people say the study of the mind, really they're talking about how we think, how we problem solve, how we do things. And that's sort of where cognitive sits. Our social cultural forces are something we also focus on. So the question is how does our society, our ethnicity, and our interpersonal reactions to things really help develop who we are as a person and who we are across cultures and even us for ourselves. So I live here on the beach, and does living on the beach give me a different sort of social cultural background than people who live on the mainland? We always call us beach bums, and those are the mainlanders. And there is slight differences, and it does affect who we become as people. And then we have to think about life force, and those what we're talking about here is that our life cycle, this life cycle forces tend to also dictate who we are. There are only certain times in our life that certain things are going to happen. And so those life cycle forces then affect who we become as people and who we are at the moment. Now, the first thing is we're going to talk about what is a theory. Theory is one of those words that tends to be thrown around a lot, and we use a very specific definition within psychology, and basically it's an organized set of ideas that is designed to explain some sort of development. Basically, a theory has to be something that has gone through some sort of scientific analysis, and it's done through experimentation or scientific study of some sort, and we'll talk a lot about scientific studies later on. But a theory is not something that comes from the gut. Now, we do hear people use words that way. However, that truly is a hypothesis because we are in a science class now. So we're not going to use theory as a guess. A theory has to be something that has been proven. We're going to be covering a bunch of different areas within psychology, and these are sort of some of the biggies you might want to say. Psychoanalysis, here we're going to be talking about Freud and Erikson. Now, Erikson's really going to be your big person for this class. In fact, you're going to need Erikson for the rest of your time if you are going into the nursing foundations. Nursing very much focuses on Erikson, and so I warn the nurses you need to be able to memorize and regurgitate Erikson. Skinner is going to come under our learners, and some of you may have heard about Skinner back in your intro class and operant conditioning. When we talk about cognitive, it's all about Piaget. Piaget is our big guy, and we will talk about Mr. V over here. He's a little bit more in the cognitive area. We don't focus on him as much. And then finally, we have our ecological, and I simply call him Urie because I say his name wrong all the time. And those are going to be our big ones we're going to focus on. Now, when we get into the chapters, we're going to get into these gentlemen a little bit more specifically and their theories of human development. Specifically, this one we're just going to kind of skim over a little bit about many of them. So when we talk about Freud, one of the things we like about Freud is that he really brings psychology into the academic world. Until Freud comes along, we mostly had psychology in the background. It was something we just did with crazy people in institutions, or it was mostly only done within academia. But he says, hey, you know what? There are other people who really need to use psychology, and we need to use psychology in multiple ways. So he brings this out sort of to the real world, which is why Freud is so well known. He also brought a lot of the words that we tend to use today: anal personality, libido, denial. These are all words that come basically from Freud. In fact, the word ego is developed by Freud. Now, Freud also develops this concept that there are three parts of the mind. And if you took our intro class, you kind of cover this a little bit. But we've got the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. Now, the conscious is what you're aware of. So right now, you are listening to me, which means that your conscious is working. Preconscious may be things that you're aware of, but you're not really focused on right now. But if you focus on it, you would understand it. Now, the unconscious is sort of our biological instincts. These are the things that sort of sit underneath the surface, and we're not always aware of it. He truly felt that if we could become more aware of our unconscious area, that we would be able to have better control of it. And that was the goal that he was working on, was the goal of control. If we look at his three parts of personality, and again, this is just a quick review from our intro class, what we have is the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. But within those three parts of personality, we have the id, the ego, and the superego. Now, remember, the id is all about pleasure. It's sort of the pleasure principle. It rules you as far as wanting to have fun. But what's interesting is that it's in the unconscious. So generally, he felt like this drive to have pleasure was something we weren't always aware were controlling us. So my great example always is this morning when you woke up, there was this little voice that said, just stay in bed. Bed is good. Don't get up. Well, you can think of that as your id. You probably weren't really aware that it was saying that to you. And he thought is that if you were somebody who were too focused on pleasure, too much trying to always have fun all the time, then we needed to help you focus on how to listen to that voice and control that voice. Well, that voice is controlled by the ego, which notice is in the conscious and the pre-unconscious and a little bit in the unconscious area. Basically, he really thought the ego was this very complex thing, but it was ruled by the reality principle. It's that little voice that this morning said, no, get your ass out of bed and move. So your ego is the one that sort of manages your day-to-day activities. He thought if your id was too big, that basically your ego got squished. So you were basically running around looking for fun all the time without really thinking about the reality of what that might do to you. So you think about the friends you know who are always sort of in trouble because all they do is run around and have fun, and they don't think about the financial costs or the physical costs this might have. And he would say they're being ruled by their id. Wherein the other thing is that we would have the ego. And if the ego was too big, it covered up sort of the id, and people stopped having fun. All they did was work. All they did was try to manage things. They became very controlling, and because that's what they needed to do was control their world all the time. So he always was looking for this sort of balance between the id and the ego. And then the last thing is he had this superego. And the superego is kind of interesting. He said the superego is really where our values and our morals sat, but it's the place that really we judge things. So we judge the actions that we took, not the actions of others, but the actions that we took ourselves. And he really felt that if you were taking an action that was not within what you thought was correct, then that tended to build anxiety. Or if you didn't know what action to take, that would build anxiety. And he had a couple of different anxieties. We're not so interested in that in this class. But you notice that the superego runs sort of the length of the id and the ego. And that's because he really felt that it had a very strong component to what we do. Also notice that if you look at this little line where the unconscious is, that most of it actually sits in our unconscious. And he really felt that a lot of what drove us, we just weren't aware of. And that's why he really focused on trying to make people more aware of their actions. Now, Erikson, he actually studies under Freud. He's what we call a neo-Freudian. And he really believed that culture was sort of at the center of what we do. It's not that he didn't like what Freud said, but he kind of just took it another step. Now, we're going to be covering Erikson a great deal when we get into each phase of life. And so the thing is that he has these 8 stages that all develop who we are. Now, we thought most of them happened before we were 18, but the development itself really varied on what he called these crises. So here are the basic stages. Don't worry about memorizing and regurgitating them now. As I said, we're going to go into these in more depth when we get into each chapter. But what we have are these basic conflicts. So when we're young, from birth to 18 months of old, he really felt like this trust or mistrust was what we were working on. And then we had the autonomy versus shame and doubt. Did we get to find that we walked and talked ourselves, or were we always worried about what somebody else was saying? Then somewhere in preschool, the question is did we begin to take initiative, or were we always feeling guilty about, trying to move forward, you might want to say. He thought in school, industrious versus inferiority becomes in there. Basically, we need to begin to able to cope with things. We need to be able to develop a sense of ourselves away from our parents. And we also need to be able to figure out if we're going to do things for ourselves, or are we just always going to wait for somebody else to do it. Adolescence is one of our fun stages. We have a couple of chapters dedicated to just adolescence. And the big thing in adolescence is beginning to identify who we are and developing that identity. And that causes a lot of strife, you might want to say, in one's life, because we have to begin to decide how much of what we decide is us and how much of what we decide is based on our parents, even down to things like the shampoo we use. Am I using this shampoo because I picked it or because my parents picked it for me? Basically, who am I as a person? And there's a lot of conflict at this time as far as internally trying to figure out who I am. In the young adulthood, it knows he says 19 to 40, but this happens a little bit more like in the 20s and the 30s. We're talking about intimacy versus isolation. Basically, are we going to be able to develop long lasting, loving relationships? Now, these relationships don't always have to be of a sexual nature. We're talking about friendships. We're talking about, good friends that we might be able to do? Or are we going to wind up in isolation where we don't have a whole lot of friends? Now, he believes that a lot of this has to also deal with identity, that if we haven't developed our identity, it's really going to be hard for us to develop intimacy. Now, this phase, when we're talking about our older middle youth kind of adulthood, basically up till retirement age, is talking about, are we going to keep moving forward? Are we going to stagnate? Are we just going to be, we hit 40 and we just don't really change much until we retire? And he really felt that the people who kept moving and progressing and doing things and finding new things were people who tended to be happier versus the people who went into stagnation where they just really didn't do much new things. Then at the end, when we talk about 65 to death, and yeah, we might actually bump that up a little bit higher. The question is are we happy with the life we've chosen, or do we tend to go into despair? And again, we're going to cover each one of these much more in depth when we go to each chapter. This is the only time, though, in your chapter you're going to see all of them together. So if you're a person who every once in a while wants to go back and say, wait a minute, I've forgotten how this one relates to that one, mark this page in your book and you'll want to go back and look at it. The chart in the book looks a little bit different than this one. I kind of like this one. I forgot where I stole this one from, but this one is a nice one because I like that it has our outcomes in it too. With the learning theorists, what we're talking about here is kind of a fun thing. Skinner, he's best known for what's called operant conditioning, and you may have heard about the little Skinner box where the mouse run around and they press these levels. Well, what he's trying to do is decide what consequence will determine if that behavior happens again. So if I push the lever and I get food, I'll be likely as a mouse to go push that lever again to get some more food. So if the consequences is something that is reinforcing, I'm going to keep doing it. However, if the consequence is something that's considered to be a punishment, then I'm going to decrease that behavior. Now, what we talk about when we talk about reinforcement, we're talking about both positive and negative reinforcement. Now, here's where we have to come back to some words. The word positive and negative. This does not mean good and bad. If you went through our intro to psych, we push this and push this and push this. Positive and negative refers to a number line. Which side of 0 are we on? And depending on what we're studying would depend on which side you would like to be on. The word we want to focus here is on the word reinforcement. Anytime you see the word reinforcement, and I don't care which one of these come in front of it, remember there's an increase in behavior. Positive reinforcement is talking about the development of something good starting. Negative reinforcement is talking about something bad ending. We don't like bad things, so we're going to make sure we don't have those happen again, and we're going to find out whatever it is I need to do to make sure it doesn't happen again. The other thing he talks about is punishment. Now, we know something is punishment if it actually decreases the chance that behavior is going to happen again. So if I touch a hot stove, I don't like it, I'm not likely to touch that hot stove again. Now, if you have not taken our Introduction to Psychology class yet, or it's been a very long time, there is a lecture called Conditioning and Learning that I put together for Psychology 101-2. I'm going to put that in our class. You don't need to watch it unless you really want to go back and sort of catch up a little bit on conditioning and learning. It is something that they assume that you know as you read through this book, because this course is supposed to be taken after Introduction to Psychology. Occasionally I get people who get this before that, so you might really want to go and listen to that. Or if it's been a very long time, you may want to choose to go back and listen to that lecture. It is not required, though. Now, with the social learning theorists, what we're talking about is observational learning or imitation. And we know, especially with childhood, this is something that people are going to do a great deal. And you actually do this even as adults, because you think about it, you're going to be watching other students, you're going to be watching other people in class do certain things, and then you're going to follow that example. So when we talk about observational learning, let's say that you're in the nursing program and you have to learn how to give a shot. Well, you're going to watch somebody else give a shot first before you give a shot. I would hope so. And so you're going to be learning by watching other people. Now, what we do find is that imitation tends to happen a lot more if we feel like the subject is popular, smart, or talented, and that we think that there's some sort of reward to that behavior. Now, with cognitive development theory, we're talking about the development of the thought process. How do we develop thought? And there's going to be a couple of people we look at with this. Now, there are 3 basic approaches that our book will talk about. Piaget, who looks at stages, so he kind of thinks of this as being step by step by step. And then we got V here, who really says that it's not only the age, but he thinks of this as sort of an apprenticeship, that basically our culture is going to influence a lot of how we think about things. And then last, there's the information processing theory. These are more about computers and how we bring information in and how we think about it. And the brain is really the best computer out there. Now, we as a class don't really focus much on this one. If you are going into education, you may want to read up on this one a little bit more. But for most of our students, since they're going more into the medical fields, it's just not one that we bring forward a great deal. So let's look at Piaget first. Well, Piaget started to notice this difference when he was beginning to help people develop a cognitive ability test, and for France. He was working with the Binet intelligence test, and what he began to realize is that, kids and adults, they learn very differently. And so as he began to notice that kids were learning differently, he wanted to know how that occurred. Well, what he began to realize is that kids experimented. They did little things. If we think about, little babies, and we think about 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds, they're trying little things. It doesn't matter how many times we tell them something, they're going to try it anyway. Why is that? Because they have no brains yet. They're little squishy things. They're not mature brains like ours. They don't even have all the parts of the brain yet. As far as thought cognitive processes are concerned. So Piaget was very interested in how does that develop over time. So what he did is he focused on development. Now, the reason this is important is he's not focusing on how we learn. He's not focusing on what we learn. He's focusing on the development. How does the brain develop over time? And then that development of the brain, how does that reflect on our cognitive thought? So don't confuse this with education. Now, cognitive stages, he believed, was because as children became more aware of their surroundings, they became increasingly more cognitive. And one of the things that's interesting about Piaget is that he came up with a lot of his concepts before we really even understood the development of the brain. So he's a pretty smart man. Now, he also believed that there are these three basic parts. Now, we're going to go into these again when we start covering, I think it's chapter 4 or so. But this is just sort of a quick overview for you. But he thought of these three basic parts to develop the cognitive development of the brain. The first of these schemas, and what schema is basically a scene in your head. And this is how we think things are organized. This is how we believe something is going to work. And as we get older, we are going to, of course, develop more of these because we have more scenarios in our head. And so if we think about it, when I'm a kid, all I think about it that there's a car and it rolls down the road. As I get older, I begin to understand that cars have parts. And then as I get older to that, that parts begin to fall apart. Then I begin to understand that there may have to be oil changes. And his question was, well, how do we begin to understand all that? And so what he said is that we have to adapt. So an adjustment has to be done. And there are kind of three parts to this adjustment. There's assimilation, accommodation, and equilibrium. Now with assimilation, what we're doing is we're using our current knowledge to understand the new objects or situation. So I'm a little kid. I understand that cars roll down the road. Somebody gives me a little play car and I roll it back and forth because I understand that that's what cars do. Now all of a sudden, I begin to understand that cars have motors and motors run. Now somebody gives me a toy car, and I begin to see if I can open the hood of that toy car. And I'm wondering, well, why can't I open the hood to this toy car? I don't get this. Well, what happens is that our new information doesn't fit our current schema, which is that cars have engines, and you should be able to open up the car and see the engine. Well, this is going to get me frustrated if I'm a little kid because this car hood doesn't open, this toy car. And so I have to begin to understand something. And what I begin to understand is that there's a difference between the toy car and a real car. Once I've got that, some learning has happened and my frustration goes away because I understand toy cars don't have engines and real cars do. Now, he believed that there were 4 basic stages. And again, this is a very, very simple overview because we're going to go into detail as we get through the chapters. The first one, the sensory motor, is from birth to 2 years of age. And basically, a little baby to 2 years, there's not a whole lot of brain power going on yet. He's basically or she's basically just getting a concept about the world. Although we're still going through those stages we just talked about, we have a belief of what happens and then things change. And that's where we get the learning. Pre-operational stage, we begin to get the ability to use symbols. And if we think about it, letters are symbols. And so why is this important? Because once we begin to understand that letters are symbols, and once we understand what symbols mean, we can really begin to develop language. The other big thing about the 2 to 7 year old age is that we only look at things based on our own perspective. So this egocentric kind of atmosphere becomes. And we've all heard the joke about the 2 year old, the world is all about me. Everything's about me. And we'll explore that further as we get into other chapters. From there, he thinks of us having this concrete operational thought. That's 7 to early adolescence. Somewhere in there, we're going to do that. What's going to begin to happen is that we're going to use what we call here and now logic. This is what I see, so this is what it must be. Things are very concrete, very black and white during this phase, and that's how I kind of remember it. It's the black and white phrase. Pizzas only have 8 slices, and so when you tell them you're getting a pizza with 10 slices, they'll argue with you that you can't have a pizza that has 10 slices, or they'll argue with you that you can't have a pizza that's square because pizzas are always round. Things are very concrete to them. It's not until we get a little bit older, sort of beyond adolescence, very late high school, early college, that we begin to develop this formal operation. And the big thing here is that we begin to develop abstract thought, and we can begin to develop hypothetical situations. So hypothetically, if this happens, what would happen? Hypothetically, if this would happen, what would happen? And this is really a big developmental stage according to Piaget. Now, Piaget sort of ends there, but we're going to find out that we keep developing thought after that. Now, Mr. V here, he's kind of interesting because, as I said, he emphasizes this social cultural influence of child development, where Piaget is only talking about development and then learning. This one's looking at how our social learning influences our development. So one of the big things he talks about is MKOs, or more knowledge of others. And what he believed is that we would learn best when we're in situations that somebody knows something just a little bit higher than me. Now, the person who knows that higher knowledge doesn't have to always be much older than me. Simply they know a little bit more. So what's going to happen is you're going to have a teacher, and in this case, my teacher knows more letters than I do, so my teacher's going to help me understand letters. But I could also be learning from a 6-year-old who knows more about letters than I do at 4. He really didn't focus on the age as much as the fact that somebody would know a little bit more than you. That led him to something called the zone of proximal development. And this is one that, again, a lot of our medical people, people in our occupational therapy assistant programs, things in our nursing programs, people in our health service administration program, will talk a lot about zone of proximal development, or the ZBD. What we're talking about is what is the difference between what I cannot do without help versus what I can do by myself. Now, what we mean by this is that, if I can't do it even with help, means that I do have the potential to be able to do it. So I can't sit there and say, well, we're going to talk about somebody who, let me give an example. Somebody who's just had their legs, unfortunately, amputated. They don't have their artificial legs yet. So we can't even talk about them walking yet because they don't have their artificial legs yet. But now they get their artificial legs. So they still can't walk. But they could if somebody lifts them and helps them and shows them sort of that step-by-step stuff. Now, the difference is what I can do by myself. Well, I can put my legs on by myself and I can learn to stand by myself. So the zone of development is sort of learning to walk. We could walk with help. We can put on our legs by ourselves. So what we're going to be working with that patient is this zone of development. Now, we also talk about doing this in school. We talk about this as adults. But basically, this is what these kind of concepts were. And again, we're going to go into these in depth as we get through chapters that focus on those areas. Remember, this chapter is just giving you a little overview, a little touch, a little taste of each one of these, so you have some basic knowledge going forward. Now, the ecological sort of approach looks at psychology very different. What they do is they say that all human development is interactive and that we can't just take one area of development and stick it off all by itself, that we're connected, but that there's no single thing to really to talk about development, that all aspects of our lives sort of focus within development. This is one of our newer areas of thought as far as human development is concerned, because it really needed to have all these other things that we've talked about to sort of come together. And what the big person that we really talk about in this one is Urie. Urie looks at this chart right here, and you'll find this in your textbook. And I'm going to just tell you right now, you get to memorize and regurgitate this. There are test questions on this. But basically what he says is that we have these different systems, and these systems are constantly interacting with each other. If you think about it, parent and child are always interacting, they're learning and teaching to each other. But I'm going to use the example of music. And I'm going to use music in Brevard County to show how these different systems come together. So if you look at the next system out here, the meso system, you'll notice that school is listed there. Well, the question is how does music and school reflect on the child? Well, let's say that you go to school here in Brevard County for first through sixth grade. Well, one of the interesting things about that is that almost all of our schools here in Brevard County have some sort of a music program with instruments that is part of our schools. Now, why do they have that? Well, let's go to the exosystem, and over here we talk about government and policies. Well, why we have that is because we had a gentleman who was the head of Brevard County Schools at one point who truly believed that music education was extremely important in the development of a child's brain. He truly believed that having spent the money on music education, that would help develop better thinking people. Well, how does he get that concept? Well, he gets that concept through historical events. And in this case, it's through research studies that show how music helps develop the young brain. So, because of this historical stuff out here in the macro system, it helped a government official decide to dedicate money to music systems. And so musical education became part of our school system. And so now if a child is in school, first through sixth grade, they will have an opportunity to learn a musical instrument. So that is where the child will come home and say to the parent, I would like to learn violin. And the parent goes, okay, you're learning violin at school. That sounds good. That's a wonderful thing. So it is these different systems that are interrelated that winds up with this child learning a musical instrument when you perhaps have parents who never played a musical instrument at all. Now, the other reason I bring music as a great example is we think about Brevard County because in Brevard County we happen to have some extraordinary music programs. You would think all schools have this music program, but they don't. So it's because we had this government official who decided that music was important in our system that we have early music education. So how does that begin to affect again the child in the long run? Well, there is this thing called all-state orchestra competition. And to compete in all-state orchestra competition, and this starts in seventh grade, all the musicians around the state play the same piece of music, and they select the top players from the state to go to the all-state music orchestra. Now, if we talk about something like violin, or even the orchestra as a whole, the orchestra might have 50 kids in it, let's say. Only so many kids are going to come from each county, and to go to all state, to be the best among the 50 kids in the whole state to play a musical instrument is enormous. Well, with violin, out of the 50 players, there might be 20, 25, oh, it's actually an even number, 26 violin players, let's say. Well, what happened one year is it's kind of a big deal is that Brevard County sent 3 people to the junior high all-state music orchestra. We sent 3 violinists. You might say, well, 3 out of 25. Well, yeah, except for the fact that Miami-Dade only sent 1. So if you think about how large Miami-Dade County is, that's the city of Miami. And they only had 1 person who could make it. And then you look at Little Brevard County, which is far smaller, but we had 3 musicians who made it to the top orchestra. That shows you the influence of music within the schools, and that all started from here, from a government official who decided that music was important because he read it about some historical events, which then got into the schools liked it, pushed it down to the child, and the parents supported it, and that's how this works. And that's what Urie was talking about, that we can't just look at this as a single event, but that it's interchangeable and that these different layers work upon each other. Now, we are talking about the lifespan approach, and there are 4 features that we're going to be talking about as we go through our different chapters. One is called multidirectional, and that's basically that the development, growth, and decline sort of happen at the same time. We're talking about maybe bones going up and mental processing going down, or this moving this way and that one moving that way. We can't say everything is moving at the same direction at one time, so we talk about multidirectional as far as development is concerned. Plasticity basically says that we can improve and develop throughout our lifetime certain skills and abilities. We talk about the plasticity of the brain a lot. If you think about that, they can compensate. The brain learns how to compensate for this or learns how to compensate for that. But plasticity basically is just saying that we can improve throughout our lifetime. And most things we do. When we talk about historical context, we're talking about how we must consider and examine development over a period of time. What was the child like at 6 months? What were they like at a year? What were they like at 18 months? And so historical context quite often can tell us a lot about development in the future. So as an example, my child did not get his first tooth until he was 13 months old. Now, I know this because we kept joking. For his first birthday, all the child wanted was a tooth. One tooth, that's it. Well, he develops his first tooth at 13 months old. So by knowing this, now that he's a much older child, we realize that all of his teeth are going to come in a little bit later. Where other kids might have these molars and these other things when they're young, my child's not going to be getting them until much later because he's just simply developing his teeth a little bit later. So a historical context in this case gives us an idea of what's going to happen in the future and what should be happening here in the present. So let's say that most kids develop their wisdom teeth around 15. We're guessing my kid won't develop his wisdom teeth until maybe 16 or 17. And so we're not going to be too worried about that because we know that simply as far as teeth are concerned, he's a little bit late on teeth development. Not a big deal. Probably something genetic within the family context. Multiple causation basically says that there is not one thing to consider again. That's sort of like multi-directional, that different things are growing different times. So multiple causation says that something is caused not just simply by a life cycle force or simply by a biological, but that we need to look at all 3 and 4 things at one time. That it could be a physiological, a social, cultural, and a life cycle all happening, and that all these things together sort of help us understand the development. And so as we talk about this lifespan approach, we're going to be looking at all 4 of those. Now, what's really interesting is that once we get into talking about sort of kids and adults and all that, our chapters are actually going to be divided up. The first chapter is always going to be biological and psychological, and the second chapters tend to be social, cultural, and life cycle. So adolescence will go over 2 chapters. School goes over 2 chapters, late adulthood goes over 2 chapters, and we have sort of this pattern that begins to emerge. Now, when we start talking about research, the other thing that we need to understand is that there's more than one research project. Again, we went through this in Introduction to Psychology. If you did not get Introduction to Psychology yet, I'm going to encourage you to listen to the Chapter 1 video that I have posted from Introduction to Psychology because it goes into more detail about research and developmental aspects of research. Again, they assume that you know this information because you've had that class, or if it's been a really long time since you've had that class, you might want to just go back and re-listen to that lecture just so you sort of catch up and have this knowledge. But the first thing that they talk about in your book is the systematic approach. And when we talk about that, we talk about 2 basic types of systematic approach. First would be like the naturalistic observation real life. So that's Jane Goodall in the day, and there's her little chimpanzee. I guess not really her chimpanzee, it's the chimpanzee out in the wild. And basically all I can do is watch them. I can't interact, I can't do anything with them. I simply watch how things happen in the real world. And we know how people say things happen versus how things really happen can quite often be very different. So we don't want to interfere in any way into what's happening. Now, Jane Goodall is probably our most famous example of this, but I use this a lot in consumer psychology. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in class. Structured observation basically says that I'm going to give some sort of scenario. I'm going to do something. And what I'd like to see is what happens after that. So I give you something and I want to see how people interact and how people work together. And we'd like to see how that changes behavior. So I'm going to observe, but I'm going to give a little structure to that observation. We also have what we call sampling behaviors. And so what we may do is we give you a task and we look to see what you do with that task. So in this case, we're asking about a kid to measure emotional reactions, which is a happy face, which is a sad face. We have self-reporting, and you've probably done this at some point where somebody has sent you a survey and they say, would you please, tell us how you felt today eating food? And you filled out this survey. It's not a bad thing. The problem with self-reporting is how accurate are you? And again, we may not be as accurate as we think. We do a lot of psychological, physiological measuring in psychology for psychological concepts. And a lot of what we may do is be measuring brainwave activities. We may be measuring pupil dilation, because here we can see physiological reactions to development and to other processes. Now we're going to be talking about reliability and validity. Now these are two words I want you to get into your head pretty well. Reliability says, are we basically going to be getting the same scores each time? I mean, a test isn't very reliable if I take it one time and I get one score and I take another time and get another score. So think about something like the SATs. If you take it and one time you get a 500 and the next time you get 1,000 and then you go back to 600, how reliable is that score? And so we talk about, this is not reliable right here. We're all over the place. Now, this one is reliable because look at that. We've got 4 little spots right here together. But we're going to say it's not valid. Why? Because we want the middle of this. So validity says, am I actually measuring what I say I'm measuring? Am I studying what I want to say? So over here we have something that's valid. We are hitting all the target. That's no question about that. But we're not real reliable because again, we're all over the place. So what we look for in evaluating research methods is something that's both reliable and valid. Basically, we're going to be hitting the middle. We're going to be close together in those scores. There's not going to be much difference. And it's going to be on target, meaning is that it's going to be talking about the things we want it to talk about. So if we want to study how smart somebody is, giving them a race to run to see how fast they can do it, that wouldn't be very valid to determine how smart they were. That determines how fast they can run. And yes, maybe every day they can run this race and they get basically the same score. So the score is reliable, but it isn't valid. And then we could do something, as I said, with the SATs, where we're getting all these different scores. And we're like, hey, this isn't very reliable because we keep getting different scores. But it could be valid because it is measuring at that moment in time what your ability to do something is. We want tests that do both. We also need to make sure you understand what a population is versus a sample. Population is a large group of people. A sample may be a subset of people. So in this case, pregnant women that represent the population. Now, we can't go and find every pregnant woman and test her, so we're going to use a small percentage of those pregnant women, and then we're going to generalize out to the entire population based on that sampling that we got. Now, we also are going to talk about that there are different types of research developments, and this is a big one, a correlation. Now, the big saying is that a correlation does not prove causation. It shows relationship. So it measures how people score on 2 different variables. And basically what we're going to be doing is looking at how 2 things affect each other. Again, if you haven't heard this before, you may want to go back and listen to that lecture I have from chapter 1 from Introduction to Psychology. We really kind of cover correlations in depth there. What we bring into this one, now that you understand a little bit about correlations, is the fact that we're not going to make those scattergrams every single time, because scattergrams, after a while, they get a little hard to really understand what's going on. So we're going to be doing something called a correlation coefficient. Now, this is not a statistics class, so you don't have to calculate a correlation coefficient, but you need to understand what the little r means. Now, little r is basically the symbol for correlation coefficient, and it can range between -1 and a +1. It can never be smaller than -1. It can never be larger than +1. Why? Here's a +1. Notice that these dots are in a perfect line, and basically we make a line straight through it. It can't get any more perfect than that. And a perfect -1 is just basically going the opposite direction. So we can't get any more perfect than that. This one in the middle, an r would equal to 0 because there is no gathering at all. There's no commonality to these at all. There's no relationship, we would say. Now, what we do have down here is an example of an r that's a +6 and an r that's a -6. Again, let's not assume that positive and negative means good and bad. It simply means the left or right is 0. So in this case, notice that the dots are a little bit further apart, and that means that there's maybe not as a closer relationship here as there is here. This relationship is dead on. If one thing moves a quarter of an inch, the next one's going to move a quarter of an inch. So a great one to use for something like this is to show something like Fahrenheit and Celsius. If something measures in Fahrenheit and it goes up, 2 degrees, it's going to go up 2 degrees in Celsius. Those things are closely related. Down here, we have the same thing here. We have two things that are related, but not exactly related, but pretty close. So in this case, it might be how much we watch TV versus our grades. We would expect the more TV we watch, the further down our grades would get. But we might also want to relink this to medication. Maybe if we take a certain amount of medication, we actually see the number of symptoms going down. So in that case, we'd like to see a negative correlation between symptoms and medication. Meaning is we want to see symptoms go down as we take more medication. So remember, negative doesn't always mean a bad thing in psychology. Now, with experimental design, we are talking about a cause and effect relationship. This is the only study that gives us cause and effect between two variables. If I do this one thing, what will be the effect of that? So we talked about the fact that there were independent, dependent, and extraneous variables. Now, your book basically just talks about independent variables and dependent variables because, again, they assume you understand what extraneous variables are. So remember that independent variable is the thing that we manipulate. It's the thing that we expose to the condition. Whereas the dependent variable is the outcome. There's always a number with a dependent variable, and that's how you always can find it. The question that we're always trying to ask is, does the independent variable affect the dependent variable? And if so, how much does it affect it? So as an example, let's say that I would like to study the effect of calories on weight loss. So what I'm going to do is have one subject eat 2,000 calories, another subject eat 1,500 calories, and maybe another one eat 1,000 calories. And that is my independent variable, is that the number of calories we consume will be different from person to person. And they do this for 2 weeks, and at the end of 2 weeks, I then measure their weight. The score they get on the weight is the dependent variable. So let's say one actually gains a pound, the first one who ate 2,000 calories. The person who ate 1,500 calories, they don't lose anything. They're the exact same weight they were. The person who ate 1,000 calories, they actually lose 2 pounds. So the independent variable did affect the outcome. It did affect the dependent variable. And that's basically what experimental design is always trying to do. Another type of design we have is called longitudinal studies. And basically what a longitudinal study is that we're going to study you over a period of time. Maybe not over your whole lifetime like this, but what we'd like to do is find out if something changes throughout your lifetime. Our biggest problem with longitudinal studies is that they are very expensive and very time consuming. Think about this. If I want to study from birth to 10 years of age, it's going to take me 10 years to do this study. And meanwhile, lots of things could have changed. We also have a problem because people tend to drop out of longitudinal studies. So over the long period of time, how many people will drop away from that study? Now, with medicine, we do a lot of longitudinal studies because we can begin to study what is the effect of medicine over a given period of time. So you can take something like a diabetic who's going to be taking insulin pretty much the rest of their lives, depending on which type of diabetic they are. And there we can look at development over a period of time. The problem with, again, longitudinal studies, though, is that they're expensive, they're very time consuming, and we may lose people. So to fix that, we have something called cross-sectional studies. Now, a cross-sectional study, what we're going to do is take a whole bunch of subjects at the same time, and we're going to be dividing them up and looking at some specific aspect. So in this case, what we have is subjects from a population. So let's just say that these are all, we're going to look at people who are 18 years of age, and we're going to look at people who are 30 years of age. And what we're going to be looking at is lung cancer. And so we're going to look at people who are 18 who smoke and versus people who don't smoke. So we're going to take this one group of 18s and we're going to look at the risk factor in the disease, and then we're going to take 30-year-olds and we're going to look at the risk factor in the disease. And we do this all on the same day. So what we're assuming is that the difference between the person at 18 and their lungs, if they're smokers, and 30 if they continue to smoke, that whatever happened is going to have happened because of the time that was there. So cross-sectional studies are much cheaper. We can do them at one point, but we do have the problem in that they are different people. So why one person seems to smoke all their lives and not develop lung cancer, and another person smokes for a little time and develops lung cancer, that's not going to be answered. We're making some generalizations. But again, we can't always wait 10 years to get an answer to a study. But at the same point, our problem with this one is that we have different people we're looking at. We're making the assumption that this 18-year-old is going to be equal to this different 30-year-old. To solve that, we have sequential studies. And basically what we're going to have is a series of studies that are going to be done over a period of time where we're doing both cross-sectional and longitudinal studies at the same time. And so this sort of gives you a chart of how complex a study like this is. Now, the word cohort, we tend to use that a lot here in psychology, and people don't always know what that is. A cohort is a group of people of something that is related. So you hear the word baby boomer all the time. You hear the word Generation Y, millennium babies, the Xers. Those are cohorts. There's something that connects them all together. In this case, it would be age. So what we have here is we're going to be looking at the year of birth. So people born in 1994 versus people born in 1996. And what we're going to do in the year 2000 is that we're going to look at 6-year-olds and we're going to look at 8-year-olds. And we're going to be comparing them. So this is the cross-sectional right here because we're talking about 6 and 8. That's a 2-year difference. But then we're going to come back 2 years later and we're going to look at 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds. And again, here we're doing basically cross-sectional because we're doing 2 ages. But we can also now look at how did the 8-year-old here versus the 8-year-old here. Is there any difference? And that would have happened because the 6-year-old grew up by 2 years. And that's the longitudinal sort of study. And then we're going to do the same thing here when they're 10 and 12. Now, that means is that we've been able to do this study now in far less time. We're able to do it in 4 years, but we got a lot of information. So we hope that usually in sequential designs that we're going to be able to get the same information that might have taken us 10 years to do by doing it in this type of format. And yet we're still going to be able to have the same people to be able to measure the difference between when they're 8 and 10 and 10 and 12 to get that longitudinal. It is a lot more expensive, but most people really feel that this is sort of the best design when we're talking about development over time. Now, another one that's become much more popular is a meta-analysis, and I bring meta-analysis in because I see this a lot happening again in medicine, and we have a lot of our students who are going to the medical programs, and as you read things, they say this meta-analysis decided this, and the meta-analysis decided that. So what's a meta-analysis? Well, here's an example of an actual meta-analysis right here, and we're looking at a bunch of different studies, and that's what a meta-analysis is. We're going to take multiple studies and we're going to crunch all their data together. Now, we couldn't really do meta-analysis until recently because we just didn't really have the computers who could do that. Now we have these computers that can really crunch these data together. So here you can be looking at, here's one study, the green is a different study. Each one of these colors are sort of different studies, and we can begin to see if these variables are repeated over time, and we can begin to see sort of a look that happens across time with this. But this meta-analysis has really been very good because it helps us to really understand sort of a bigger picture of what's going on. Now, the problem with the meta-analysis is that we're only using secondhand data. We don't collect anything new. It's all based on old research. So while meta-analysis are really nice, we also have to remember that this data is not fresh. Lastly, what we like to talk about is the process of communicating our results. And basically, since we are again talking about mostly in the medical fields, we're going to use what's called a peer review process. And what happens is that here a paper is going to be written by somebody. So I've done some study, I've now got some information, I'm going to write my paper, and I'm going to submit it to a journal. Now, remember, we're not talking about any old journal here, we're talking about a peer reviewed journal. Again, if you need to understand more about this, go back and listen to that lecture on Chapter 1, Introduction to Psychology. Now, what happens here is that that's been submitted over here to the editor. They're then going to take that and they're going to hand it out to a whole bunch of people who are going to look at that paper, determine whether or not it's good, bad, or indifferent. They're going to review it for accuracy, validity, for reliability, procedures. They're going to make comments. They're going to give that back to the editor, who's going to perhaps give it back to the author. And the author may have to make some changes, and this process will keep going around. Now, the thing is that we keep going around in this until we feel that the science is right. When we feel the science is right, then and only then will it get published in a peer-reviewed journal. Now, this becomes important because when things are published in peer-reviewed journals, we tend to think of them as being the best science, or at least the most accurate science of the time. Now, it doesn't mean that it won't change over time, because we learn things and we say, oh, here's the information we had and this was the best we knew at the time. I like to joke about the dinosaurs. We apparently had the wrong dinosaur heads on many a dinosaurs for a very long time, and we had to go switch the dinosaur heads. Somewhere in the 80s or 90s, they figured that out. And we used to think that the tails dragged on the ground, the dinosaurs, and now we know the tails probably were up and above the ground. I always wondered about that dragging on the ground. Wouldn't it scrape it up? But, we now know it's actually up and they were walking. So things do change over time. But peer-reviewed journals are important because when something comes out in a peer-reviewed journal, we tend to feel like it was the best science at that time and that it wasn't just somebody guessing. So this isn't going to come out in Time Magazine or USA Today. This is going to come out in something like the Journal of American Medicine, or JAMA. And that's one of the ones that we hear a lot. So on the news, quite often they'll be reporting, tomorrow in JAMA, they're going to publish this, blah, 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 blah. And so what they're reporting on is some information that has been received, tested, and we now believe is accurate. Well, this sort of ends up our first chapter here in developmental psychology. I will see you in class, and have a good day.